here.
How do I share a screen now? Okay.
No, it's.
How do we share a screen? I don't see
You're talking
it.
about recording?
No, it's recording now, but I'm trying to share the screen. Oh, share screen right there. You want to share that, right?
Yeah.
All of these maps?
This one.
Then only this one.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, and so then
medium and a large. I also got this.
But, can you bring up the rest of it?
what do you mean this?
Yeah, so that I can. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Thanks so much. Good afternoon. I guess today we'll be doing a review question and then entering more deeply into Indian history. Before I begin, are there any questions that have arisen from the lectures, or question of format of the course and so on, or that concern you and that you want to raise?
If I could jump in. So I sent you an email on Monday about this, but if you wanted to expand on question 11 from the assignment.
Question, could you, which is question 11?
Oh, the question was just an extension of the original question, is that if you think that capitalism will lead to progressive human development.
Oh, discussing, so the question is, I guess what I would say about capitalism is that, in my view, capitalism has led to progressive human development. Think only of a dentist. You know, people in pre-modern times, if your teeth got into trouble, you know, it could be fatal or unbelievably difficult and very difficult sort of to deal with rotten teeth and so on, or mouth infections or so on. In other words, I'm suggesting that capitalism, with its technology and its science, and you can't separate the two, has been a progressive force. There are people I actually know, in fact, I work with them, who in my discussions with them say no. They argue that capitalism has been a regressive force, that it's just caused endless misery. And in fact, overall, in terms of human development, poverty on a mass scale, because most people on Earth are actually terribly poor. But I don't feel that way. I feel that especially the benefits of technology and science are extremely important up to a point. So I would say that, but if the question is whether capitalism in the future can be a progressive force, I would tend to doubt it. Because coming back to what my remarks at the very beginning of the class, I've said that in my view, capitalism has hit a wall, and that the ecological problems, we're going to ignore the social and economic and political questions, just the ecological question, continuous material growth has now become a negative. It's becoming destructive. It is destructive. And capitalism is based on continuous economic growth, material expansion, and it is going to obviously destroy, it has enormous destructive power, and so it will lead to destruction. That's my view. Now, this is as I've already indicated, it's a discussable point. So does anybody have a comment on what I've said or on the question? Would you like to discuss this a bit more? Because it's a central, obviously, it's the central question that we're facing as human beings. You're in first year history. What do you think about it? Does anybody, yes?
Yeah, so just in the other book by Bakshi, he argued that it in fact wasn't progressive human development. It was more so destructive, and a lot of the characteristics of capitalism were already present in places like India and China.
Before capitalism came along, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that you've been reading books to that effect. Could you mention what books or what the sources might be that you're referring to?
Yeah, it's one of the textbooks by Bakshi, Perilous
Oh,
Passage.
oh yes, Bakshi. Well, um, I'm not sure whether he takes that point of view. I know Bakshi, and what his point is that until very recently, the mass of humanity did not benefit at all from capitalism. It was only after about 1870 that capitalism began to have trickle down, and that in the advanced countries like England, the United States, Canada, some of the benefits were distributed to the mass of the population, and the standard of living began to improve. And that's true in the West. But if it's not true in the whole of the third world, which is part of the capitalist system, except for China, the rest of the world has not benefited from capitalism. So I would say that, but I think the technological and the scientific advances are potentially, this is the point, the capitalism made huge breakthroughs in technology and in science, which if they were more democratically distributed, would make an enormous difference to people's life. Because for most of, as you see, and what we're discussing here, most of these countries that were, I would include Latin America, they were under this landlord elite, warrior elite. You have political and economic misery in Latin America, in the Near East. You'll see the same thing is true in China and India. So people were suffering right through history. And in modern times, we have a choice here. We can continue down the road we're going, which is toward destruction, in my opinion, or we can reorganize things in a way that will be more democratic. And also, we can, most people can have a decent life. That's the point. It's possible today for most people on earth to have a decent life, provided the social relations change in society and we stop producing so much. We need to redistribute more than produce more. I'm not saying we don't have to produce. No, I'm not saying that at all. But we have to produce, and particularly we have to produce more happiness, more parks, more health, more enjoyment for people, rather than endless amounts of consumer goods. That would be my view of the current choices that we're facing. So I guess that's the way I would sort of answer things. But I do know some very remarkable professors at this university who I work with. Like, for example, there's this woman, Radhika Desai, in political science. How many of you know of Radhika Desai? I just want to know. Anybody? I recommend her courses to you. Likewise, there's a guy by the name of Peter Kolchisky in Native Studies. Really smart guy. And I'm talking about the courses in university that can change your life, that can really be meaningful in terms of getting a real education. I recommend his courses to you as well. But those people take the view that capitalism from the get-go was a bad thing. I just don't agree with them. We have these ongoing disputes about this question. Anybody else want to raise a point or further discuss this? Okay, I guess we can move on. And I think it would be it would be a good thing if, as we continue, if questions arise, I think we should try to have a discussion, a dialogue about them, and see where it takes us. So I want to, before I move on to the narrative of the Indian history, I want to go back and deal with questions. Oh yes, there's one more item I want to deal with, and that is the possibility of a strike. I don't know whether there'll be a strike. You may have heard that the faculty has voted by a very large percentage, if necessary, to go on strike. Well, all I can say is I have been through several strikes, and this course is arranged in such a way that the effect on you is going to be minimal, because you have a term paper that you're producing, and you have a final exam that you're preparing for. In terms of the term paper, if there is a strike, you continue to work. You continue to work on your term paper. And in terms of the final exam, I will only put on the final exam the questions that we've covered, so that if we don't get to all of the, 31 questions or so, well, if we only get to question 23, that's it. I'm not questioning you on the rest that we haven't covered. So in terms of your eventual grade, I wouldn't be too concerned with what might happen. Any questions? Okay. So now, looking at question 13, which is Mehmed II was the true founder of the Ottoman Empire. What would constitute an answer to this? Well, I would say that you should begin by giving me some background and say that, well, the Ottomans appeared in Asia Minor in the beginning of the 14th century. They became auxiliaries or servants of the Seljuk Turks, who for centuries had been fighting the Byzantine Christian Empire in Asia Minor, for control of Asia Minor. So there were the Seljuk Turks fighting the Byzantines, and the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, come down as auxiliaries from Central Asia at the beginning of the 14th century. And the Seljuks basically say to these Ottomans, go fight in the Balkans for Islam. And so the Ottomans, many crossed the Bosporus, a strait separating Asia from Europe, the narrow strait, and in the course of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Ottomans basically conquer most of the Balkans, and they subordinate the local princes, including some Christian princes, to this emerging sort of Ottoman empire. And by in the course of the first part of the 15th century, the Seljuks basically have become subordinated to the Ottomans. So the Ottomans basically take over the position of the Seljuks, as well as the fact that they have already conquered the Balkans as well. And they're fighting the Byzantines for control of the western part of Asia Minor, and also obviously for the fate of Constantinople. That's the background part of the answer. Then the founding act of the Ottoman Empire is the conquest of Constantinople and the renaming it as with the new Ottoman name of Istanbul. This happens in 1453. And so it's a momentous act. It's the founding act of the Ottoman Empire. This confirms the idea that Mehmed was the founder of the Ottoman Empire. And then you might say something about the fact that Mehmed was able to both form a huge army and a huge navy in effecting this conquest, including the use of Italian engineers to build and to utilize the cannon, which basically broke down the walls of Constantinople. And when that was accomplished, of course, Mehmed decided that the city would not be destroyed, as was the custom when infidels resisted a siege, but no, it would become the capital of a new Islamic empire, a new Islamic Rome. And at the same time, he, in effect, refounded the caliphate. Remember, the caliphate was the Arab rulers were both the heads of the Arab empires of the Middle Ages between the 8th and 11th centuries, the caliphate, and they were also the head, the religious head of Islam, known as the caliph. So Mehmed becomes the ruler, the sultan over Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire, but also he's now the caliph, harking back, of course, to the Arab empires. Finally, he does begin to rebuild the city and to renew its population by ordering tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people living within the Ottoman Empire to move to Istanbul to repopulate the city. Now, this act, as I say, is the founding act. You should mention the fact that the news of this event was an alarm signal to Western Europe. Western Europe was frightened by the rise of a new Islamic power, and of course, it also meant that the commercial routes to India and to the Far East were imperiled by the Ottoman conquest. Then finally, you want to tell me that this new Ottoman Empire was a centralized state. Mehmed II changes the sort of from indirect rule, which had been the case prior to 1453, to a full-scale bureaucracy. I've described the bureaucracy as it existed under Solomon the Magnificent. And then lastly, if you mention the role of the Jews, the Greeks, and the Armenians, these are the so-called protected flocks, the people who are not members of the Ottoman elite. And you want to say that, first of all, they were required to pay taxes to the Ottomans, but they also were allowed through the emerging millet system to govern themselves, both religiously and in terms of local government. That's the answer. So that takes care of this review question. I'll try to get to another one on Friday. Any questions about this? Okay, very, very good. I want to go now get into the narrative dealing with Indian history. Now, we left off last time. One of the remarks I made last time was that India is in a way, it's paradoxical because it has a very long history, but very little sense of history. That Indian history begins 2600 BC, but the history of India was not really part of the consciousness of the population that lived in India, especially in the ancient period and in the early Middle Ages, because the literature of India, and they began to produce a literature as early as the middle of the second millennium BC, 1500 or so, was overwhelmingly religious. It was a religious literature. There was poetry, there were stories, there was some, even we can say, metaphysics in this very large corpus of Indian writing, but no sense of historical time. It was only the Muslims who began to really become a presence by the 11th century AD, who wrote a kind of history. The Muslim rulers who came down and conquered India from the 11th century onwards had chronicles. They kept chronicles of their heroic acts, of their conquests. And we do have basically, yes, chronicles of the great events of some of the more important rulers. That in that sense, we have history. Did somebody have a question? No. Now, on the other hand, I noted that the Greeks and the Romans, they knew something of Indian history because Herodotus, this Greek historian of the 5th century, he wrote an account of Indian history, and subsequent Greek and Roman historians added a bit to Herodotus' account. So there was some understanding of the West of the history of India. The modern history of India began to develop in the 19th and then into the 20th century. But again, it was the West. It was German scholars and British scholars and some French scholars who began to investigate the archaeology and the history of India. In other words, it was from the West that a modern understanding of Indian history emerged in the modern period from the 19th century onward. And as you probably know, history is a discipline, really. I mean, the history of France or the history of England in its modern form only begins in the 19th century. People really don't have a very good sense of history until the 19th century. And that's no less the case with Indian history. So a little sense of history. Religion, as I've indicated, is overwhelmingly more important to Indians. And now, another, I think, barrier to sort of a comprehension of Indian history is the fact that and I've already noted this, the Indians seem to be obsessed with religion. In this case, whether it was Hinduism or Islam, religion seemed to be everything to the population. And a more secular approach, the idea that politics was as kind of a separate realm, was very foreign, or social economic matters, was very foreign to the mentality of the Indians. There was, because India came to be conquered in the 18th century, the Western scholars, whether they were British or German or French, tended to view India disparagingly, negatively, and they associated India with the question of perennial poverty. Most people seem to be terribly poor. The religious obsession seemed to stand in the way of any kind of economic development, any kind of modernization. And there was also, in addition, the whole question of the caste system. I'll have more, of course, to say about the caste system in a little while, but the caste system was seemed to be particularly awful thing. And also the treatment of women in Indian society was also very notable. They were really terribly oppressed. So the West had a very negative attitude. Now, many of these attitudes, which in some ways I think were unfair, and especially from what we know later about what has happened to India since it's got its independence. See, I need to, yeah, here. Many of these attitudes were formed part of, in terms of a very influential scholar who in some ways, along with the Frenchman Comte, can be considered to be the founder of sociology as a discipline, this German sociologist, Max Weber. He did a kind of comparative sociology of the different religions, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, Islam, and so on. He was very negative on Hinduism. And basically he said that many of the negative features that I've mentioned were the result of Hinduism as a religion, that the Indians were stymied by their obsession with Hinduism, the religion of the majority of Indians. And I would say that Weber, who took a similar view of Islam, this is a very characteristically Eurocentric position. And it does remind me of, for example, I mentioned with respect to when we were discussing the Near East, I mentioned the work of this scholar Edward Said, who wrote this important book on Orientalism, basically saying that the West has misunderstood Islam, and he makes a very persuasive case. I would say the same thing is true in terms of understanding Indian culture as well. And I would say offer as proof of this, if you look at what's happened to India following its independence in 1947, I show the date of independence. India, of course, split into two countries. There are two countries on the Indian subcontinent, actually three, Bangladesh. India and Pakistan are the main country. Well, India is still overwhelmingly Hindu. In fact, Hinduism has made a comeback. I regard this as unfortunate, but never mind. Nevertheless, Hinduism has become, like in many places, including North America, religion, particularly fundamentalist religion, has gotten stronger, particularly in the neoliberal period. The same thing is true in India. We see that Hinduism has gotten stronger in India. But look at the Indian economy. The Indian economy since 1947, when the British were forced out, British imperialism was forced out, and where the landlords lost some of their power. I don't say that the problem of landlordism in India has been solved, but nevertheless, the landlords have a lot less power than they did under the British, we see that India has had enormous economic growth. Not quite up to the level of China, but nevertheless, Indian capitalism has thrived in the post-independence period. And so at the same time, Hinduism is still there. So Weber's idea that, and the West's idea that India can't develop based on the persistence of certain traditional religious and cultural attitudes, I think, has been falsified by what has happened. So I'll leave that for now. I just want to I was just trying to clear away certain prejudices. Now, to enter now into the narrative of Indian history. For convenience, I'm sort of dividing Indian history into 4 parts. So the first part is the formative period, and I'm getting ahead of myself, I realize, but nevertheless, we can call this the Hindu period between 2600 and 1200 AD, 2600 BC and 1200 AD. I'm just giving you an overview of Indian history. Now, this period, you see the date 2600 BC. It's comparable to what's happening. This is slightly later than the development of civilization in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. But nevertheless, it's quite early. 2600 BC is quite early. And it's in this period, and we need to sort of delve into it, because it's in this period that Hinduism, which is the religion of the majority of people on the Indian subcontinent, comes into being. So we have to, and it comes into being gradually. It develops historically over time. So we want to follow this development. This is the main thing I'm doing today. I'm looking at how Hinduism develops, because yes, Hinduism develops through this whole period and right into the Common Era, that is to say, as late as 1200 AD. But from 1200 AD, India comes under the conquest of Islam. India is conquered by an invading Islamic army. By about 1200 AD, the Muslims take over. They become the ruling class in India. And this continues for centuries until the middle of the 18th century. So what I'm saying basically is that this initial phase, there is this gradual development of Hinduism and Hindu civilization. And then it is subordinated after 1200 to the Muslims. And the Hindu population becomes subordinated to the Muslim population through the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And then the situation then changes. The British take over in the middle of the 18th century, and they remain there for 2 centuries. And believe me, India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, because enormous amounts of wealth were taken out of India and sent to England or Britain during this period. I'm not saying the British and the British Industrial Revolution wasn't important. Of course, that would be absurd. But India was the main colony, and it provided enormous supplemental wealth and markets. Finally, the Indians and the Pakistani basically forced the British out in 1947. The British Empire began to fall apart right after World War II, and the British withdrew from the subcontinent, and India and Pakistan and eventually Bangladesh emerged on the Indian subcontinent. These are the three countries on the Indian subcontinent. Are there any questions about this overview? I want to make sure you sort of have understood it. Okay, so now we've arrived at the point. We're going to look briefly at the beginnings of Indian civilization, and most scholars agree that it began with what we call the Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley civilization. Let's see if I can. Just hold on. There we go. Right here. Now, this area is the area where there is a river known as the Indus River, and there's a great valley. This area largely today lies in Pakistan. To the west is Afghanistan. And so you have Afghanistan here, and a lot of this area here is now the state of Pakistan. But it was obviously in those days, you can consider it part of India. And in this valley, which once upon was way back, very moist, as it dried out, people moved into this area, and agriculture developed round about 2600 BC, and many villages developed. And out of this, there developed what we call the Indus Valley civilization. We know that primitive state system developed. There were priests and kings. There were some towns. Most people lived in villages. And of course, there was therefore a kind of ruling class, a ruling elite that collected tribute from the peasants who lived in these villages. This was a Bronze Age civilization, just like Mesopotamia or Egypt. The metal that was used was basically bronze. We know that there was flooding, there was the necessity of irrigation, and so one of the achievements of this civilization was a quite sophisticated system of irrigation and hydraulic works, moving water from one place to another to irrigate the fields or to control floods was one of the characteristics. We don't know very much about the culture of these people because we do have writing, but the writing has not been deciphered. A few fragments that are understood, but for the most part, the languages of these people and therefore their culture isn't very well understood. We do know that they obviously worship various gods, and one of the gods that they worship was the god Shiva, which is one of the gods of Hinduism. So the cult of Shiva, which is one of the elements of Hinduism, is already being practiced amongst in this earliest of Indian civilizations. Now, there's some scholars make the argument, perhaps you understand this, but northern India, the people in northern India are different from the people in southern India. In the southernmost part of India and in Sri Lanka, or as it was once called, Ceylon, the people Many of them are Tamils. And we have lots of Tamils in Canada. In Toronto, there are hundreds of thousands of Tamils who have come over from southern India or from Sri Lanka. Well, some scholars associate this early civilization in the Northwest with the Tamil population of the South. Some others disagree. This early history of India is controverted. There are disagreements, and I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. Well, that basically is all we want to say about the Indus Valley civilization. It seems that as time wore on, this area became drier and drier, and this process of drawing out or desiccation ultimately made this region so dry that this civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, essentially disappeared. All we have are the archaeological remains. There's been a lot of our archaeological investigation of this early civilization, but round about 1700, it was more or less on its last legs, and a new group now appears who basically take over most of India. And these people are called Aryans. There is what is referred to as the Aryan invasion. Coming down from Central Asia, second. The Aryans take over India between 1700 and 1000 BC. And for a long time, that was the story. These invaders from Asia, from Central Asia, come down. They're looking, these people who know how to, are very good on horses. They have chariots. They're nomadic. They're looking for richer pastures. This is a chronic or a perennial phenomenon, of course, historically. We've already seen this with the Turks. The Turks are in the Near East, coming down from Central Asia where the land isn't so fertile, down into the more fertile regions of the Middle East, and also descending into India. This is a repeated pattern. Well, these Aryans come down with their horses, with their chariots. They're warriors. They have large flocks of cattle, and they basically impose themselves on the people of the Indus Valley, and indeed most of the Indian continent is conquered by these Aryan invaders. And with them, they bring their languages with them. They bring their language, the Aryan language, if you like. But the significance of this is that some of the main languages of India emerged directly out of the language used by the Aryans. Sanskrit, which is the religious language of the Hindu religion, originates from the Aryans. And the more modern vernaculars of Hindi and Bengali, which are spoken by millions of people or written by millions of people, they likewise come from this Aryan language. So this is an important development in terms of Indian culture. But furthermore, it's the founding texts of Hinduism, known as the Vedas, the earliest text that we have, mythological, ritualistic, even philosophical. The so-called Vedas these early religious texts likewise were written down by the Aryans. And so this is quite formative in terms of Hinduism. The Sanskrit language and later the vernaculars, and then the Vedas, these early religious texts derived from the Aryans. Now, I want to say something finally to sort of end up. One final point about this Aryan civilization, which is important. Today in India, I've already noted that there is this revival of Hinduism, indeed a Hindu fundamentalism, extremely xenophobic. It's very hostile to the Muslims, who were regarded as oppressors. It took over by these Hindus, these Hindu fundamentalists. And today, the government of India is controlled by these, I would call them Hindu extremists, control Indian politics. They are the dominant element in Indian politics. And they, along with others before them, have promoted the idea that the India was formed by these Aryans. They are whiter than the rest of the Indian population. There's a certain racism in India. And this ruling elite later constituted itself as the Brahmin elite of India. These are the rightful rulers of India. So this is a kind of mythology, because serious scholars basically deny these connections. Indeed, they even deny the idea, I said, that the Aryans invaded. Well, some of these scholars are saying, no, there was a kind of infiltration of these new people. There was no conquest, it was just an infiltration. The idea that the Aryans dominated the whole of India is not true. Now, the other aspect of this I want to mention is that this idea of, as I say, it's associated in India with a certain racism. No less true in the West. Starting in the 19th century, this idea of the Aryans as the basis of European civilization was promoted by certain racist scholars in the West in the 19th century. And it's out of this that this idea of Aryan superiority, the white race, developed in late 19th century, early 20th century Europe. And eventually this became part of Nazi ideology. So this idea of the superiority of the Aryans plays a role both in contemporary Indian history and also in the history of fascism in the West. And I would say that a lot of this is being debunked by scholarship, but nevertheless, it still has a political resonance, and that's why I'm mentioning it. Well, I'll sign off at this point and pick up the narrative in the next class. Thank you. My cat is demanding attention. So have a nice afternoon.